Okay, so at this point, we talked about various things about putting the application together. But after you put the application together, you submit it off into the breach and it gets reviewed, and then you get the results back. And very often, those results might not make a whole lot of sense to you. I clearly remember getting back in the old days before there was an internet system to get your scores, that they used to come in this carbon little thing that looks like a check. And I opened it up and there was a number and there was a percentile. And to be honest, I had no way of knowing whether that was a good or a bad thing. And then I guess at this point, maybe 7 to 10 years ago, they completely upended the scoring system that I was trained under. And so what I'm going to be talking about is the current NIH scoring system. Now, some of you might be applying for grants from other funding mechanisms, and that in the sense of how the scores are and how to interpret them, it could be very, very different. But I hope that some of the take-home messages about how to deal with your reviews will still be helpful to you, even if you're not submitting to the NIH. So, all right, let's see if I can get my computer to work. Okay, so once you've submitted a grant to the NIH, you have an ERA Commons ID, and that gives you access to ERA Commons website. All of the results and scores and reviews and everything from your NIH submission will be available to you on that website. And in fact, you can even download the full application if you need to go back to it. So everything having to do with your review will be accessible to you through the NIH ERA Commons website. Now, when you submit your grant to NIH and it's first assigned to an institute and then a study section, that you will be given a date about when that grant will be reviewed. Now, generally, somewhere between 36 hours and a week after the meeting of the study section is when the actual score gets posted to the ERA Commons website. Now, it will be posted actually up there very often, up to a week before you get an email from NIH saying that the results of your review are there. So it's a lot of people who are very, very anxious about getting a grant score. They know about when their study section meeting was, and they basically start checking the ERA Commons website about 2 days after that meeting. It can take longer, but like I said, it's not at all unusual for a study section meeting to be a Monday and a Tuesday, and the scores to be on the Commons site by Friday, even though you're not going to get an email to check until the following week. Now, when you go to the ERA Commons site and you click on your grant, that there's going to be a place where it says, this is the study section, this is what it met, and this is the score. Now, the thing that you have to understand about NIH, which is a little backwards from other scoring paradigms, is that a 1 is good and a 9 is bad. And that the actual number you will see is on a 10 to 90 scale. So once the reviewers have reviewed your grant, they're going to give it a score from 1 to 9. And what NIH does is that each assigned reviewer gives an impact score of 1 to 9. Each member of the study section, first each assigned reviewer gives the grant a score on 1 to 9. These are averaged, and then all of the grants seen by the study section are rank ordered from the best score, which the best possible here is a 1, to the worst, which the worst possible is a 9, and they draw a line. And only grants that are in the top half of grants that the study section is considering will even be discussed by the study section. That if your grant is in the top 50% of primary scores, It is discussed by the study section, and then each member of the study section, even people who did not read your grant and maybe only gave the application a quick skim or only heard the discussion, also scores your grant. So in a standard full-blown NIH study section, there's usually 20 to 30 reviewers in the room. That 3 people read it, but the 20 to 30 people all score it. They then average all of the scores given and multiply that by 10. And that is the impact of your grant. That's the impact score of your grant. Now, when you get onto the ERA Commons website, you'll see either one of two things. You'll either see a ++ underscore. That meant that your grant was triaged. Or you could see a not discussed. If there is a numerical score, you will see scores on a range from 10 to 60. The reason that you don't usually see scores worse than 60 is, one, because of the triage system. If the average score is worse than a 60, the likelihood is it was not in the top half of grants. Occasionally, you'll see somebody get an impact score of 60 or 65. That's usually a grant that was right on the bubble of being triaged, or the initial scores, there was a big difference of opinion. So it got discussed, but in the end, everybody came down on the worst side of the score. Okay. Now, the impact score basically gives you an idea of how your grant did. Again, if you have a number, it usually means your grant was in the top half of the grant submitted. Now, another thing that you can look at is that if the score ends in a 0, so let's say it was a 10 or a 20 or a 30, it usually indicates that all 3 primary reviewers were in complete agreement, which meant that there was no possible scoring range for the non-assigned members, and everybody in the room, just everybody gave your grant a 3, which meant that the average is a 30. However, very often your score won't be a 30. It will be a 27 or a 22, which means is that the primary reviewers had a difference of opinion, and the members of people in the room voted with one reviewer's opinion versus another. So the average ended up being, let's say, a 22 or a 27. Now, the thing that I want to emphasize is that the impact score does not really tell you whether or not your chances of being funded or not. Now, the reason for this is that most NIH funding decisions are not made on priority score. They're made on a different number called the percentile. And that percentile is essentially how your grant score stacks up against all the competition that has been seen by that study section for the past 3 study section meetings. Since a typical study section sees about 100 grants a round, that means that your impact score is compared by the impact scores of approximately the 300 applications that study section has seen over the past year. Now, what that means is that if you have a first percentile, that means your grant was in the top 1% of grants submitted. If you have a 45th percentile, it means it was in the top 45% of grants submitted. Now, the reason that percentiles are used and not impact scores is that every study section has its own culture. And what that means is that the exact same impact score can result in very different percentiles in different study sections. As an example, in the study sections that see my grant usually, it is pretty much unheard of for a reviewer to give a grant a score of a 1. Which means is that it's extraordinarily unusual for anybody to get a score better than a 20 on the final score. As an example, a 23 was a So that a score of, let's say, 16 or 17 might be a score, a percentile that's 22. And because of this difference in culture, that the percentiles are used to flatten the playing field so that grants that are seen by different study sections can be considered together by funding for the institute. Does that sort of make sense? Okay. So that if your grant went to what's called a chartered study section, in other words, a study section that meets on a regular basis, you will see both a score and a percentile. However, that you don't always get percentiles. Now, if you see no percentile coupled with no impact score, that means your grant was in the bottom half of applications. The chances of getting funded are almost nil, and you really should think about drastically changing your application if you reapply, because it means that you were in the bottom half of all grants submitted. Now, sometimes you will see no percentile, but you will get an impact score. And that's because you were reviewed in a situation with no percentile history. Sometimes that is a case where you were reviewed in a very special panel because you have collaborators or yourself has some conflict with the chartered study section that would normally see your grant. Maybe one of your collaborators is a permanent member of the chartered study section. Your grant cannot be seen by that study section. It goes to a special panel that doesn't have a percentile history. Or you applied to a special request for applications where there's a one-time study section that is chartered to review the grants. Under those circumstances, you can say, oh, if I got a 16, that's really, really good. A 45 is likely to be pretty bad. But to know where you really stand, you have to talk to the program officer for the grant mechanism. Just to give you an example, both the IMBRI and the CTR P20 grants that are funding this grant training, that they do not percentile those. The reason is that there is only about 20 eligible states that can apply, or 25 states that can apply. There's not enough grants for that mechanism submitted to make percentiles meaningful. So they just give you an impact score, and you have to talk to the program officer to see whether you're going to get the grant or not. Now, if you have a high percentile, and let's say over a 45th percentile or so, this means that you are either at the not discussed threshold. So if your score was just a little worse, you would have been triaged. Sometimes it's because there was a big disagreement among reviewers, so that you were discussed at the very tail end of the meeting, but minds weren't changed. Or the reviewer who thought that your grant was better than the other decided to move their score closer to the worst score. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that percentiles in the top 10% are really, really great. But they don't guarantee funding. That depends on your institutional pressures or things that you're interested in. I just want to make sure. Can people hear me? Aaron, can people hear me? Or am I talking to space? Let me just get out of here to make sure that I'm still live.
I can hear you. Sorry, it just took me a while to unmute.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure because my phone was just ringing in my office, and I just wanted to make sure somebody wasn't calling me to say that we weren't going anywhere. Sorry about that. Okay. The reason, so typically everybody on this call is a first-time investigator. That first-time investigators, if they're applying to our level grants, do get priority over established investigators, and usually that priority means that your funding percentile is significantly better than 10th percentile. So generally, as a first-time investigator for an R grant, if you're in the top 10%, you're likely to be funded. However, for instance, back at when there was the crash in NIH funding back in 2009, I know people who had 5th percentiles who were not funded. Now those percentile scores are way better than they used to be, but different institutes have drastically different funding rates. Different grant mechanisms have drastically different funding rates. And so this is really something that depends on financial situation, institute priorities. Now, if your percentile is worse than a 10%, that's less great, but it's still possible to be funded. This could depend on whether there's finances. It could be if your application is in an area that's a really big push by that institute and you're one of the few applications in that area, they will fund you over applications with better scores. Also, as a new investigator, you also have another funding priority because NIH is very, very committed to making sure new investigators can get first-time funding. All right. Now, another piece of language that you need to focus on is that you'll hear these terms bandied about, but they're not the same. There's percentile, there's success rate, and there's pay line. Now, percentile I've already talked about. That's the percentage of grants that did better than you when you in the grant submission game. Now, you will see institutes in the NIH statistics talk about success rate. And I think right now, NIH-wide, the success rate for R-level grant submissions is on an order of about 26%. Now, when you see 26% and your grant got a 23rd percentile, you're like, yes, I am well within the success rate. I'm going to get funded. Well, unfortunately, that's unlikely to be the case. And the reason is that when NIH calculates success rate, they're counting the chances of a grant with the same number getting funded eventually, which means is that the grant's initial submission and a revised submission are counted as one application. So when you see 26%, that means that a grant or its revision count as one application, so that any grant that you send to the NIH has about a 26% chance of getting funded. It might not happen on the first time you submit it. It might happen on the second time you submit it. Also, success rates count one-year bridge awards. So sometimes NIH will have some money left over at the end of the year, and there is a lab that will be shut down if they don't receive any funding. So NIH will give that lab a one-year grant, which will count as a success for that application in that the grant was funded, but the applicant has to essentially reapply immediately as a new submission because it's only for 1 year. Now, so what you actually care about when you submit your grant and you're trying to figure out whether your percentile is funded is a term called the pay line. So the pay line is the percentile where the institute tries to fund all grants who do better than this. Now, if you look, depending on where you're getting your funding, sometimes institutes will publish pay lines. They will say, we will fund every grant whose percentile is above that number. That, for instance, this musculoskeletal disease and disorders, they have a published pay line. I believe the National Institutes of Aging have a published pay line. However, for instance, the National Eye Institute does not. And the reason that they don't is that they want more flexibility in deciding funding. They do have a best case scenario pay line in their head at the program office, but it's not on the website, and they will sometimes not fund grants that are within that historical pay line. And just to give you an example of a case where I know this happened in the National Eye Institute a few years ago, that there was a cycle where essentially every single major investigator studying herpes virus infections of the eye submitted all their grants for the same cycle. Since these were like all the top investigators in the field, all were scored, and they all scored very, very well, which meant that most of the grants within a certain percentile were actually all in this rather narrow area of herpes virus infections of the eye. Well, the National Eye Institute has a lot of priorities outside of herpes virus infections of the eye, and they couldn't give all of the available funding just to that one niche disease. So what that meant was that there were some grants in that area that scored exceptionally well that weren't funded, while grants that were studying other diseases who did not score as well were funded. That new investigator status will definitely mean that people who are first-time NIH-funded investigators will get grants over people with better scores who have not had NIH funding before. Okay. Now, in the end, you try to suss out as much as you can from that number. But the thing you need to understand is you can only guess when you see those scores that you really don't know. And if you really need to figure out what you should be doing going forward, you really need to contact the program officer assigned to your grant. It's that program officer who makes the primary recommendations to funding. Usually the program officer's decision is what will be funded. Now, there's going to be this very strong temptation that you see the score and you immediately want to talk to that NIH program officer because you want to know whether you're going to get funded or not. However, that is premature. You shouldn't contact the NIH program officer right after the score is posted. You really need to wait until after the written critiques are released. And this is about 2 to 3 weeks after the actual numerical score is posted. The reason the reviews take longer is that the person dealing with the review has to read all the reviews, make sure that there's nothing in those reviews that would be inappropriate to go to the applicant, and wants to make sure that the written critiques and the scores are actually coherent with each other. So you've gotten your score, you're going to be, and let's say you got the score of a 16th percentile. You might get that funded, you might not get that funded, and you really, really want to know. But you really need to wait for that 2 or 3 weeks until you get your grant reviews back. Once the grant reviews are posted to the ERA Commons site, then you should be contacting the program officer. Now, one thing that I want to emphasize is that NIH program officers will never tell you your funding chances by email. This requires a phone call. And the reason it requires that they won't answer by email is that anything that they email you is considered an official act of theirs from their government job, and they do not want to give any kind of written commitments to funding. However, they will talk to you and they'll say, oh, the chances look extremely good, or you're on the line, you really should work on your resubmission, or no, you really don't have any chance of getting on the funding list. They will tell you that verbally over the phone, but they won't put it in writing in most cases. Now, one thing though, you don't want to cold call the program officer. Keep in mind that they just got the results from probably several hundred grant reviews. Each study section might see 100 grants, and that there are usually multiple study sections feeding scored grants into a single program officer. They don't remember your application, and they're not going to be able to tell you anything about it. However, if you email them and ask for an appointment for a phone call, that way they will tell you, oh, yes, I can talk to you at a certain date and time. That allows them to prepare. They can pull your grant, they can pull your review, and they know your situation, and they'll know what they're going to say to you when they talk to you. Now, one thing that you can also keep in mind is that if the program officer says that you won't be funded, you want to have your grant reviews in hand and be prepared to ask specific questions about whether you should reapply, and if so, what things do they really think were important score drivers that you really do need to change in the application. And some program officers will give you a lot of advice. Other program officers will say, well, I can't really give you a definitive thing because that depends on the study section, but looking at it, I would suggest that you focus on these things. But when it's all said and done, one of the most critical parts of the conversation is to be polite. Do not be aggressive. The thing you need to understand is that program officers were not involved in the peer review. They did not choose your reviewers. They did not score your application. So they're simply working on the advice from the study section. They can't manufacture money. They have to have a lot of justification to fund grants out of line. So if they fund your grant, which is, let's say, a 26th percentile, and they don't fund somebody with a 14th percentile, they have to really justify that. So by being polite, by telling your situation, by really trying to sell the significance of your work, but not in an aggressive way, your goal here is to want that program officer to like you and to be your advocate for funding. You want them to think, well, if I have a little bit of end-of-year money, maybe I can fund this person. The last thing you want to do is make the program officer annoyed with you or make them an enemy. Because while if you're within the pay line, they'll still fund you, they're not going to go over and above and out of their way to fund you. Okay. Now, so we've kind of talked about scores and what the numerical scores are. But when let's say that if you got a score and you're going to be funded, great, you're happy, we're all said and done. But the reality is that most grants you're going to be submitting to the NIH will not receive a fundable score on your first submission. That's the reality for anybody, whether you're an established investigator or whether or not you're a new investigator. That one of the articles that I gave to Erin to post was a recent study done by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. And they basically looked at grant application behavior and the behaviors that get somebody funded and get them to stay funded. And the number one predictive factor of somebody getting funded is to apply and to apply regularly. That people who don't get funded in the end really don't show very aggressive grant behavior. Which means is that you're going to be submitting a lot of grants that do not have scores in the fundable ranges. So at that point, you need to decide, am I going to send in a new application, or am I going to revise the application that I just got the reviews for? So you're going to be reading those reviews with a fine-tooth comb trying to make that decision. Now, probably the most frustrating thing for applicants is you have to understand is that you feel that the reviews are written to you. Like when you submit papers and you get your paper reviews back, the reviews are largely written to the person who wrote the paper. They're suggestions on how to improve the paper to make it better so that it's a better contribution to the literature. That is not the same thing for grant reviews. Grant reviews you are not their primary audience, and they are not intended to help you improve your application. They are only instructions and information for the program officers to help them decide which grants should be funded. And in fact, in the instructions to grant reviewers are actually actively discouraged from giving mentorship to applicants. That you're just supposed to evaluate, say what you liked about the application, what you didn't like about the application. And while there's a line in the review for advice, that's not usually used by grant reviewers. Now, the other thing is that unless you got a crazy, wonderful score, you're going to find something upsetting about either the score or the written reviews. And probably the most important piece of advice I can give you is that just understand you will be mad. You will grieve over that bad score and review. And you actually go through the classic stages of grief, which is sadness, anger, acceptance. That you first see the score and you'll be very, very depressed. Then you look at the reviews, and very often you get very, very angry. The reviewer will say something that you think is ridiculous. The reviewer will say something that you think is unfair, or that you feel you already addressed in the application and they didn't see it or read it. And I think anger is both the most common reaction and the most damaging reaction in your ability to get funded. And in fact, how I handle this is that I see the review, I read it enough to get the gist, and I just shut it, I close it, and I stomp off mad. And sometimes I won't look at it for a few days or even a few weeks. And you just have to not stare at the reviews and stew when you're in that anger phase. You just have to say, all right, this is the situation. I'm now no longer angry, and now I just need to go back and analyze it. Now, there's a few things that I recommend. One is to talk to experienced grant reviewers at your institution or your field. Keep in mind they cannot be members of the grant panel that saw your grant. You can't discuss your grant with anybody on the study section to help you interpret your reviews. You're actually forbidden to contact study section members about your grant. However, you can talk to people in the field or people who used to be on the study section for sure. Also, you should take that review, copy it to a Word document, and break it up line by line about every single comment they made, about every single bullet point. And then you should look and objectively look at every single comment made to see what is they're really saying. If you think you addressed the comment in the grant and they missed it, then you need to go back and carefully read your grant and find where you feel you already addressed their comment. And then sometimes it can be helpful to discuss the reviews with your program officer once you think you understand them. Some program officers will give a lot of feedback, some won't. If your program officer clearly finds mentoring investigators irritating, you let it go. But in other cases, the program officer really wants to help you get funded. All right. So you've got the reviews, you saw the negative comments, you got the score. Now you need to understand what was the important comments they make and what are the less important comments they make. Now, that there will be the overall impact score. You're not going to know what that was for any particular reviewer per se, because the impact score is only the average of all the scores from the study section. However, your 3 reviewers will have scored each what's called a criterion score. Now, the scoreable criteria are investigator, which is you, environment, which is where you work, significance, innovation, and research plan. Now, one thing you have to understand is that the impact score, in other words, the importance score, is not an average of the criterion scores. And in fact, some of them may not be strongly considered by the reviewer. That there have been studies that have shown that the strongest correlation between impact score and the criteria scores is your research plan score. But that correlation is left to the reviewer's discretion. For K awards, very often the research plan score is less important, and the investigator or the mentoring plan, which is part of a K award, are scored as a higher importance for this. Now, one reason that it's not just a rank average of the criterion scores is, to be honest, the vast majority of investigator scores are 1s, 2s, and 3s. Even for grants that might get an impact score of 8, it's not at all unusual for the investigator to get a score 2. Because somebody can be a great investigator who wrote a crappy grant. Now, when you look at the criterion scores, they'll definitely give you some guidance, though, on what parts of the application they thought were weak. For instance, let's say you got a good score for research plan, investigator, and environment, but you got a terrible score for significance. Well, significance can be a major driver. It can be a perfectly well-structured research plan, but the reviewer just didn't think it was insignificant. Or you got a poor score in innovation, which it might be telling you that the reviewer thought the grant was somewhat boring. It wasn't interesting or cutting edge. Now, when you look at those written comments that I told you that you should look at and move into a Word document and start analyzing one by one as you're deciding what to do about a resubmission, keep in mind that these are most likely to be bullet points. They're not a paragraph. That's the actual directions to the study section members from the NIH. Their only goal is to justify the criterion and impact scores. And generally, if a criteria score is worse than a 3, the reviewer is obligated to give significant weaknesses to show why that score was worse than a 3. That said, according to the scoring scale, scores of 1, 2, and 3 are all very, very strong. So they might have given you a 3 on research plan and don't seem to be giving any negatives. That the reviewer will be allowed to do that, which is very frustrating to you as the applicant, because if your grant score was a 30, in other words, 3s across the board, you're unlikely to be funded in most study sections. But that's also a score where the reviewer's not really obligated to point out any kind of significant weaknesses. Now, one thing you have to understand, though, is that the written comments may or may not tell you really what the big issue is of the grant. They might have scored it based on their overall impression, but when they write the written comments, they're just trying to backfill to justify what drove the score. And what that can often result in is the applicant saying, I don't understand why my score was bad. The reviews only pick on little things. It doesn't seem like there's any real reason that my grant ended up with a 40. Nobody said there was anything wrong with it. Why did I get a 40? Well, in the NIH scoring scale, technically a 40 is a strong grant. In most cases, the grant is in the top third or half of applications. You're competing against other faculty level people. It's not fundable, but you're at that range. But you also don't have any guidance on how to go forward. Now, very often it's that there actually isn't anything wrong with your grant except that it's boring, it's not cutting edge, or it's a topic that the reviewer wasn't interested in. In the articles that I gave Erin, there's one that says they're just not that into you. And this is basically, you're fine, the institution's fine, the science is well described, it's fine. But the problem is sort of nothing that makes the reviewer get really excited. They just think your project is kind of blah. And if you're picking that up from the reviews, is that, yeah, you can do good science and all, but you need to study something that really is going to have a bigger impact. You need to concentrate on framing your scientific question more than on the concrete comments. You need to really explain, why is your work so important? That impact score is, where does your grant fall on potential impact to the field? Is the field going to be different in 5 years if you get to do your project? Now, this is a place where it's important to be brutally honest. Maybe you're interested in it, but objectively, other people aren't going to be interested. Maybe the question you're studying is trivial. This is a place where you have to be brutally honest with yourself when you get this feeling that the reviewers just thought your project was blah. If it really is a trivial project, that you need to reevaluate your direction. Resubmitting the grant isn't going to necessarily get you a better score, because there's nothing wrong with the science. It's that the actual scientific problem isn't interesting. Now, another thing, though, that can happen is that your grant was submitted to the wrong grant mechanism or reviewed by the wrong study section. And this can happen where a grant seems like it should fit into a particular study section, it's reviewed there, but that the target of the grant and the scientific expertise of the study section have a mismatch. NIH has done studies that show that grant scores are higher when reviewer expertise is high in general. They basically, that if somebody really, really knows the topic, really, really knows where the knowledge gaps are, and you submit an application that is filling a long-term knowledge gap, they're much more likely to get excited by the application. While on the other side, if it's just something that the reviewers are not really that interested in the topic, that means that they're just not going to give it a great score because they just don't find it that interesting or exciting. So let's say that you did not get a fundable score on your first round. It really comes down to, should you resubmit or not? Now, in the end, you will never get funded if you stop submitting grants. That it's known that behaviors that get you funded will keep you funded. The biggest one is just keeping submitting grants, reworking your projects and resubmitting them. That I had a former faculty colleague here at Delaware who could not take a bad grant review. He never would submit revised applications, even though your chances of getting funded on a revised application are way higher than on an initial submission. He just never could look at the reviews and get in there and revise the grant. You also want to really objectively say, though, can you fix what the reviewers found wrong with it? Because one thing that's really important is I call it Wile E. Coyote syndrome. That is the Roadrunner cartoons, and the coyote sometimes had great ideas for catching that Roadrunner, but the idea would fail, and he would never try the same idea again. So one thing is that you really need to get some advice from other people in the field and really be honest with yourself. Is this a great idea? But you need to have more refinement. You need more preliminary data. You need to be able to frame the argument in a way more understandable to people who aren't you. There's an article in the set of readings that's called Writing Out Rejection, that being able to get a critical grant review and come back is a major, major thing. And if you're going to be in science, you just have to figure out how to do that for you. Now, your other decision, though, is you absolutely need to be submitting another grant if you want to stay in science. But the question is, do you submit the work as a revised application, or do you rework the ideas drastically and send in a completely new application? Now, according to NIH studies, a good rule of thumb is that if your grant was scored, in other words, in the top 50%, and the critiques seem addressable, you should resubmit. However, if the grant was not discussed, you need to think about this very, very carefully. According to NIH statistics, the chances of getting funded, of a revised application getting funded when the first submission was not discussed, are relatively low. Now, that said, personally, I have managed to take a grant that was triaged and gotten it funded on a resubmission. However, that's statistically unlikely. So under the current rules, you can actually take a grant that was triaged in the first submission, you take the reviews, you change the grant title, you rework the grant to deal with those reviews, and you can submit it as a new application, which means the prior negative reviews will not follow the application, and that while the prior reviewers may or may not be assigned to it, no matter what, the prior reviews are not following you. And this is a case where it's a very, very situational thing, but often the better powder valor, if your grant did not score well on its first submission, is to just start over and take the application, rework it drastically, and submit as a new application. Okay. Now, if you submit a new application, you won't have any ability to respond to the prior reviews. You're simply reworking the application in response to them. However, if you do decide to submit a revised application, there's some definitely very important rules of thumb. One, never give a snarky response to the reviewer comments. Never be sarcastic. Always be highly respectful. Even in the case where the reviewer missed information and gave you a bad score because of it, you have to say it's because you didn't write a clear application, so the reviewer missed the information. And rework the application to make it clear where it is, or even say that important piece of information in multiple places in the application so that the reviewer won't miss it. Now, if you're revising an application, you do have a one-page addition to your grant, which is Introduction to the Revised Application. You're not going to be able to, in that one page, comment on every single point of the reviewers. However, you should be looking at the 3 reviewers and combining similar points together and saying all 3 reviewers found such and such problematic. I have changed the application in this way for this reason. But even in situations where you don't have room to talk about every comment that you're addressing, definitely make sure that you change and revise based on every single comment. Now, while you don't have to agree with absolutely everything, you do have to take them into account. And if it wasn't clear to them, you need to directly address why the reviewer might be mistaken. By blowing off the reviewer, you're basically not being very respectful for them. But this is somebody who is very knowledgeable in your field. They have current NIH funding, and they really are kind of the respected people in the field. Now, sometimes the reviewer didn't understand the point you were making. Now, sometimes it's because the reviewer was tired, they were reading this quickly at the end of a long day, and they just missed the point you were trying to make. However, you should be writing your grants with that very person in your mind's eye. Your grant reviewer is not somebody likely to be well rested, is not somebody who can spend many hours on your application. It's somebody who's extremely busy, who's doing this essentially at near volunteer amounts of money. So if the reviewer in that situation missed your point, you didn't write the grant in the way it needs to be for the reviewer to understand your application. The other thing is that very often people think they said something in a grant application, but they didn't. And the reason is that instead of coming out and explicitly making their point, they will talk about a set of evidence, and they expect the reviewer to be coming up with the same conclusion from that set of evidence that they did. However, that's extremely unreasonable. The applicant has been working on their projects for months or years. They have a framework in their mind. You cannot expect a reviewer to come up with those same conclusions just in a few hours that you've spent years on. So you have to get over beating around the bush and instead just explicitly make your points and your justifications as clearly as possible. Okay. Now, I already mentioned that you shouldn't be snarky. You should never write a grant rebuttal while angry. That, yes, they dissed your hard work in your grant, but to be honest, in most cases, when a grant reviewer says that a grant has problems, it's because it really does, particularly if it looks like all 3 reviewers agreed. In that case, you had 3 field experts who basically made the same determination about your grant. To be honest, probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the time, all 3 reviewers will come to the same numerical conclusion about a grant. They might write different critiques, but they're still going to be very often in fairly close agreement about what the grant was like. Which means is that, no, there's 3 people who agree that the grant had problems. So if you try to write the rebuttal when you're angry and you're sarcastic and you make it seem like you're not respecting that person's opinion and you resubmit, you're just going to make the reviewers uncharitable. Even if it's a new reviewer reading your grant fresh, if you disrespect the prior reviewers, they're going to be very, very worried about your judgment. Now, sometimes the reviewer is wrong. Then you basically talk about why you respectfully disagree and give many citations showing why your interpretation is right while the reviewer was mistaken. Now, like I said before, the tone has to be respectful and professional. that a reviewed rebuttal just puts the reviewer in a non-charitable mindset. I actually, a few years ago, saw this happen to somebody who should have been an up-and-coming new investigator. Their first submission of the grant had gotten a decent score, but it wasn't within the pay line. And they clearly didn't talk or show their rebuttal or their resubmission to any of their mentors. And they wrote an extremely sarcastic and disrespectful introduction to the revised application. And they essentially didn't change the grant. And what happened was that the reviewers largely weren't the first reviewers, but this nasty rebuttal essentially put everybody in an uncharitable mindset. The reviewers basically came down hard on that rebuttal, and the grant got a worse score than it did on the first submission. And it essentially destroyed this guy's career because he needed to get this grant funded to keep his lab operating. And because he wrote a nasty, sarcastic rebuttal, he basically had no one on his side going forward. So that is a really, really important point. And then the other important point is that when you submitted the first time, you had gotten all kinds of letters of collaboration, letters of mentoring, letters of somebody who's willing to send you reagents, and you put all of those in the application. It is an extremely bad idea to just turn those over into the next submission. Instead, you should get new, recently dated copies of any letters that are added to the application. The reason is it takes about 9 months between the grant is submitted to the time you're resubmitting the revised application. That if it's a crucial collaboration, well, somebody should be willing to give you a new letter. Reagents sometimes are no longer available long term. The reviewers want to see that the reagent is still available 9 months after the first submission. So do not resubmit old letters. Definitely you want revised letters that have dates very close to the new submission. And this is really super important for mentoring and collaborations, because if you are in a really vibrant collaboration with somebody, you should be in close enough contact that there's no trouble getting a newly dated letter of collaboration. Reviewers know there's a lot of kind of ghost or collaborations in name only, and they want some reassurance that that is not the situation here. Okay. So with all of that, really I would say to you to respect the process of grant review. And yeah, it is not always fair. And in my experience, the reason that it's not always fair is because it can be, sometimes fields are very, very small. And it can be very difficult to get direct field experts to agree to grant review. Maybe they have their own grant due. Maybe they're teaching. Maybe they have a lot of other things going on. So that means is that they have to sometimes get reviewers who are not the top field expert to do the review. But with all of that said, there's really not a better system for identifying the best science. That if you have somebody who is a non-field specific administrator who doesn't really know the science or know the problems, you really don't want them making the decisions about how to give out scarce grant dollars. Another thing is, it's always easy to assume reviewer bias. And the very first reaction that you will get in that angry phase when you got the reviews back is that maybe the reviewers were out to get you. And one reason that it's easy to blame the reviewers is that then it's the reviewer's fault. It's not your fault for not writing a grant in such a way to make it understandable to somebody. So you really do need to be self-aware. You need to learn how to handle rejection, and you need to learn from rejection. Now, sometimes people will make claims that there's this broad reviewer bias. And it probably does exist, but I've been reviewing grants for 20 years, and it is much, much rarer than applicants suppose. And in fact, you see reviewers basically even state publicly that they're sad, that they really like a project, and they're sad that the grant had such and such problems because they think the work should be done. The reviewers like to read like to read good grants. They like to be excited about science. That's one reason to do grant reviews, is so that you can read really exciting and interesting stuff. It's really depressing to read a bad grant, actually. So, it's hard to keep in mind that the reviewer is actually on your side, but they really are. But you have to give them the information that they need to be able to advocate for your grant at a study section. And as you think about reviewer bias, think about, would you ever give a biased review and hurt or help an application because the applicant is your friend? I think very, very few people would do that. And just keep in mind that the senior people in the field were once in your shoes. Okay? So with that, I think I got through this. I want to open things up for questions. If anybody has questions that they want to ask right now. Anybody? And if anybody on the call also ever has any questions about their grant reviews or anything, you're always welcome to contact me offline as well, and just send me an email and we can talk about it. Okay.
Hi, this is David. Hi, actually, I have a question.
Sure.
Hey, sorry, I did join late. My apologies. You had mentioned, and I think in one of the slides that said that perhaps one of the reasons why a grant was not favorably reviewed or wasn't successful is because it was the wrong study section, or perhaps another study section might have been more favorable. What's the best way to go about determining or feeling out what the better study section might be? You go back to the section head or
Okay, so I can give you one is a kind of a big picture thing. So it might not even be the study section. It might be that your grant and your work might be more favorable through a completely different granting agency. And I'll use myself as an example that I have been pretty successful over the years getting funding from the National Institutes of Health. I can't get funded by the NSF for anything to save my soul. I can't get education money from them. I can't get research money from them. It's like I write grants to the NSF and it goes into the black hole. While in contrast, there's a couple members of my department who have been extraordinarily successful getting NSF money, and they can't get NIH funding to save their soul. And some of it has to just do with the different funding priorities of the different granting agencies. Some of it might have to do with the way we do our grantsmanship, but that can be a really, really big picture thing. Now, if you're talking within NIH, that one thing that it could be that the way you wrote your abstract or your specific games page made the people doing the assignment think that your work was studying something that it was not. So generally, for chartered study sections, there are short descriptions about the scope of the chartered study sections. You can also do lit searches on all the people who reviewed the grant. So if you when you get your reviews back, there's going to be the roster of the people on the study section. And you can go and do PubMed searches of everybody on the roster. That will give you a very, very good idea what the expertise and the research interests are of the people who are members of that study section. And sometimes that expertise does not come through very well on the written description of the study section. While another study section might, when you do that same kind of analysis, and you can always pull the rosters of the prior meetings, and you can also usually pull the rosters of the chartered members. Those are the people who have the 5-year terms to be permanent on study section. Now, if you have a grant that you've submitted as an A0 and it went to study section 1, it is very, very difficult to get it reassigned to a different study section as a revised application. However, if you think that you were on the wrong study section, you're going to probably want to be submitting this as a new application. You will want to be rewriting your Ames page and your abstract to make sure it is very clearly within the scope of the study section that you want it reassigned to. And then there's also a place when you submit where you can suggest institutes and study sections. And you should put that information into the submission when you go to submit. So that would be my my suggestion. And sometimes you can talk to the scientific review officer. So your grant, let's say, went to study section 1, and you think that it might have ended up in the wrong study section. You can definitely contact that scientific review officer and talk to them about it. That would be another way to figure out why they think it's best in their study section and not the other study section. Because sometimes you don't necessarily understand the particular scope. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you.
And I think there was somebody else who had a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay. So this is Kyoko. I just send a message to the chat, but I just gonna ask you directly. So I have a question about the pay lines you mentioned, and is it like roughly speaking, take it as fund availability or competitiveness of the different institute?
Oh, how the pay line is set, you mean?
Yeah.
So the pay line, the pay line is essentially a ratio. It is. There is several things that go into the pay line. First of all, it has to do with how much congressional appropriation the institute got.
Mm-hmm.
It is affected by the number of people in the field. Like a really big example, and it's also affected by what I would call institutional priorities of how funds are given. So I think a really great comparison is the National Cancer Institute and the National Eye Institute. The National Cancer Institute usually has pay lines well more competitive than 10%. That it's off. Their often pay lines are in the 6th, 7th, 8% range. While the National Eye Institute, over the course of my career, their pay lines have bounced between 14. The worst that it's ever been is 14%, and I've seen it as good as 30%. Okay, that what sets the pay line has. So part of the reason the pay lines of those two institutes are so different is that the National Eye Institute has a stated institutional priority to fund our awards. And that of our awards, they have an institutional priority for almost all of their extramural grant making to be RO1 grants. They do not have a P mechanism, so there's no group projects. They call out very, very few specific requests for applications, and they let very few specific extramural contracts. Also, the field of eye research is just relatively small as a field. The largest international meeting in eye research only has about 6,000 abstracts submitted. Let's go to the other side, National Cancer Institute. The National Cancer Institute gets a way larger budget than the National Eye Institute does. However, they have large centers, they have comprehensive cancer centers, they give group projects, they give a lot of their money in institute-directed extramural contracts, so that they just don't give the vast majority of the National Cancer Institute's extramural money is not given to R-level grants. On top of that, cancer is a glutted field. There are way more investigators who work on cancer than the field can support as R01 funded investigators. Some of that has to do with the institutional priorities of the National Cancer Institute, in that they don't prioritize funding R-level grants. Some of it is that everybody wants to study cancer because their Aunt Mildred got breast cancer when they were 12 and they got inspired to study cancer. So you have a huge number of people in the field, and in the end, there just isn't enough money to support a high pay line for all of those institutional reasons. Does that sort of make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So, and now, like I said also, though, that there are sometimes, and I actually don't know about National Cancer Institute, but some institutes have published pay lines and others do not. And that's also, each institute, even though it's the National Institutes of Health, there is absolutely not uniformity in how the extramural programs are run and how they're prioritized. So that's why you can see such huge differences institute to institute in how things are handled. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
This is new information, so because I'm just considering that which institute will be a best fit, and yeah, I just found that
so you can. Good. And you can find the pay lines are sometimes posted, but the success rates are all posted for every institute, for every grant mechanism on NIH Reporter. So you can look at for the past 3 years or even 10 years for every single NIH institute. For each particular grant mechanism that they fund, what is the success rate? Now, there are some K awards that have a 40 to 45% success rate. There are some R awards that might only have a 2 or 3% success rate, and everything in between. So, and you can also see exactly the number of applications that were submitted and the number that were funded. That's all public information on the NIH Reporter site.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yep.
Do I got any other questions? Okay. So, like I said, if you guys ever have any questions kind of offline, you're welcome to send me an email, and I'd be happy to consult with you. Okay. So thank you guys very much.